Thank you.
Isn't this one of the coolest rooms that you will ever be able to speak in? Isn't it amazing?
It's deeply cool.
Yeah, it's really, really cool. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And it's great to see a sold-out crowd. I love the energy. I'm Elex Michaelson. I anchor at 5, 6, and 10 o'clock on Fox 11, host a show called The Issue Is, which airs Fridays at 10:30. I hope you'll watch it. That's enough of my self-promoting for the night. Let's really talk about this book. And I had the privilege of reading this book this weekend, and it is fantastic. And it is, I think it would be relevant at any time, but right now it's way more relevant. And it's sort of the perfect time to have this book, to talk about this book, and to get into it. But before we get into it, I think we have to get into what's happening in the world right now, and a perfect time to talk to you. And just why don't we start with your overall reaction of what is happening right now, what you think of what's happening in Iran?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here, great pleasure to see all of you, and great pleasure to be at the Nixon Library. It's a real honor and a treat for me. I was with some friends last week when the Israeli strikes on Iran began, and you probably all know, but some months ago, the Israeli Air Force took out most of the ground-to-air missile defenses that the Iranians had put in place. The Iranian Revolutionary Government, I should stress, is different from Iran. The Revolutionary Government's air defense system would almost completely be taken out. When the Israelis first went in, some 10 days ago or so now, they had such extraordinary set of successes in their strikes against the leadership. Almost all of the military leadership of Iran, apart from the Ayatollah, were taken out. A vast number of the nuclear sites were hit. Around half, it seems, of the ballistic missiles in the armory of the mullahs was taken out. And a few days in, I said to a friend of mine who's a historian who's visited this place many times, I said, what do you think this war will be called? And he said, at the rate the Israelis are going at, it might be the 5-day war. I like the idea they're just getting better and better at it. You know, you have a 6-day war, a 5-day war. Hopefully we'll never have to have a 4-day one. But it was startling to me that for many reasons, but one of them then, of course, was that President Trump fulfilled his promise to the American electorate, which many American presidents have said, but he followed up on, which was that under no circumstances could the world's most dangerous regime have ownership of the world's most dangerous weapons. And but I would just add that there's one part of that quite often people outside of the region don't understand, which is it's not just that the revolutionary government in Iran would have control of the world's most dangerous weaponry. It's the fact that if they did, we would see the kind of nuclear proliferation which we have feared since 1945. The world's most dangerous region would have control of the world's most dangerous weapons. Everybody in the region, the Saudis, the Bahrainis, everybody would either create their own nuclear capabilities or would be effectively buying nukes off the shelf, which sadly you could do in such a situation. Some people say, well, the kind of nuclear deterrence that President Nixon and others understood would be completely passé. What would happen if the Middle East was nuked up to the hilt would be effectively a Mexican gunfight, where the whole of the region and the wider world would be at risk of just one of those tripwires being crossed at any moment. And nobody outside of the region thinks that's a good idea, and President Trump has acted on it. But it's very striking, just two things quickly. One, look at the number of countries around the world which also said for decades that the mullahs could not have nuclear weapons. And what did they do about it? Nothing. The presidents of France, the presidents of Germany, the prime ministers of Britain, they all say they can't have the bomb. But other than saying that's why we must go around the nuclear negotiating table again and get strung out for another 10 years by the Ayatollahs, they were never going to do a thing about it. The most striking comment of the last week, in a way, was Chancellor Merz of Germany, who said in front of the German media, he said, the Israelis have just done our dirty work for us. What an extraordinary thing to say. But he was completely right. So it's a slightly long-winded way to answer the question, but let me just answer that very quickly. The question will be for historians, will what we're living through at the moment, what will it be called? What will the name of this war be called? It might be the war of 1979 to 2025. It might have been that when the Ayatollah Khomeini was allowed to fly back from Paris to Tehran in 79 and then spread terrorism across the Middle East, maybe that's about to come to an end. Maybe it'll be known as the post-October the 7th war, because I think it's something I write about a lot in this book, but just consider the fact that when Iran's proxy of Hamas decided to did invade Israel on the 7th of October, hoped that their fellow Iranian proxy of Hezbollah would join in. Just consider the fact that what Yahya Sinwar did that day led not just to his own demise and the near destruction of Hamas, but the almost complete destruction of Hezbollah, which has been throttling Lebanon for decades, and now leads to the fact that the Ayatollah Khomeini has very few friends left. There was a left-wing Labour leader in the UK called Jeremy Corbyn some years ago who I was not a fan of. And he became notorious because, among other things, he had been, in the 1990s, 2000s, he had laid a wreath on the grave of the Munich Olympic terrorists. Can you imagine? Anyway, I was asked by the British media this week what I thought, and I said, Jeremy Corbyn's floral orders must be beyond belief. The amount of money he must be spending on wreaths as we speak. He'll be in debt by now.
For it to be the 1979 to 2025 war, do we have to have regime change? I mean, does that mean that the Ayatollah is out?
Well, it's a very interesting thing. This was obviously something that President Trump was considering last week. He has had a very difficult corner to navigate, in my view. His promise that he would prevent the mullahs getting the bomb, and at the same time his promise to his base not to get involved in further Middle Eastern wars, or indeed any foreign wars. This is not an impossible by any means juncture, but it's a difficult one. I think so far he's navigated that well. He's done what he believes he had to do to stop the main plants, Fordow and others. But he's been very careful not to get into the regime change discussion. I happen to think that that's wise for many reasons. But one is that the future of Iran has to be seen to be in the hands of the Iranian people. And personally, I hope very much that the Iranian people seize their country back from the Ayatollahs. But it would be dangerous, to say the least, for Iran to be effectively needing regime change to be installed from outside. I think it would involve this country and this country's allies in a very complicated mission, which we're not up for. And what's more, the Iranian people needs to be their victory if they manage to do that. There should be in the future no myth like there's been about Mossadegh and the Shah, that this was brought in from outside.
So last night, President Trump was looking really good. It seemed like the ceasefire was in place. Then this morning, we get news that Iran violated the ceasefire, Israel violated the ceasefire. You see him saying to the media, they don't know what the F they're doing, which I can't remember a president saying it that explicitly out there. And then some news this afternoon that maybe, at least the first intelligence, that maybe everything wasn't obliterated, that maybe it only delayed them a couple months. How confident are you that this ceasefire can hold and that we did what needed to be done and that this war actually does come to an end?
First of all, I'd be very surprised if the damage was as minimal as that. I don't want to sound like I'm imitating Trump, but he dropped a lot of bombs. A lot of bombs.
Big bombs, too.
Big bombs.
Big.
Maybe the biggest. Maybe the biggest
bombs than you've ever seen before.
You know?
Yeah.
No, I mean, the munitions he dropped on Fordo and elsewhere, I mean, it did not leave much left. There are questions about the removal of fissile materials from some of these sites, but I'd be surprised if it had merely been set back a couple of months. By the way, one of the very interesting things about the squirrely times we're in, maybe we always are in squirrely times, but one of the strangest things about it is that exactly the same people from the left and the right, from all over, who a matter of days ago were claiming that Iran was not seeking a nuclear bomb, are now saying they're mere weeks away from creating it again. I mean, it's like you've got to get your story right somewhere in that.
But do you trust that Iran and Israel now are incentivized to actually stick to this ceasefire?
Well, as I understand it, what happened was that Iran sent another ballistic missile at Israel, and the Israelis were ready to respond. So if somebody shoots you and you say, sorry, but we've got a ceasefire. But I understand the president's desire to say, look, I've intervened, I've done what I needed to do, now stop. Again, this is a difficult corner. My suspicion is that we'll see in the coming weeks exactly what was achieved, and if it were to turn out that the remaining members of the Iranian revolutionary government did decide this was the moment to rush again for a nuclear bomb, I would hope an American president would stop them a second time.
What's the nature of your relationship like with President Trump?
There are cameras, aren't there? There are. And I see an audience. I take the view that he has many virtues. There are things that he's done, including this, which I think many people would not have done. And I enormously admire him for that. I try to take the big picture on these things. A lot of people are obsessed with the sort of small picture things. But in my view, if you're right on the biggest things of your day, I allow a lot of latitude on the other stuff, including the odd F-bomb.
Obviously, we're here at the Nixon Library. You got a chance to tour some of the exhibit here. Foreign policy is such an important part of Richard Nixon's thinking and legacy. What lessons do you think we can learn from his experience and his worldview that can be applied right now?
Well, one of the extraordinary things about writing about history, and also writing about history as it's happening like this, is after the facts, everybody is a wise guy. Everybody always knows what they'd have done after the thing has happened. And I think that's one of the things that happens with Nixon's legacy, as with many other presidents, perhaps his in particular, I have to say, which is a lot of stuff gets lost. It's a sort of useful exercise, apart from anything else, for our own sense of humility, to consider and just remember what history is like when you're going through it. I mean, we're going through it right now. We've lived through about a decade's worth of news in the last 7 days. Mm-hmm. I remember a story of Rupert Murdoch saying to some politicians some years ago, slow down, guys. You're giving us about a year's news every 24 hours. And this is one of those times, perhaps it always is like that to some extent, but I'm very fond of a quote from the late Czech writer Milan Kundera, who said in the 1990s in a book of his called Testaments Betrayed, he said, the interesting thing about mankind, he said, is that we go through life in a fog. We stumble along a path and we try to navigate and make the path as we go. He says, the interesting thing is that when we look back, we see the man and we see the path, but we don't see the fog. Mm. Everything seems as if you're always going to end up there once you've ended up there. But you've only done so through wise, hopefully, people navigating their way through the course of events. To my mind, one of the singular things about real political leadership is to have a clear and determined policy and to see it through whatever the day-to-day problems that emerge. President Nixon certainly saw that in his foreign policy and other policies. But it just all looks so inevitable in the rearview mirror, but it isn't. I mean, in President Nixon's time, I mean, now every high school student can think that, for instance, communism wasn't going to spread. I mean, it wasn't like that half a century ago, and it might not have come out this way. Just on that major issue of the time. I mean, one of my great concerns is historical education, and somebody said recently that I wrote a couple of books back about the dire state of education in the West, and somebody pointed out, if your child comes back from school in many parts of this country, and you ask them what they know about Thomas Jefferson, they'll tell you that he was a slave owner. And then if you ask, do you know anything else? Well, it's the same. Our collective memory of the past is lacking at the moment, and that is one of the things that worries me, because political leadership is not something you can do on its own. You need a well-navigated population as well, who value the things that are good about your country, who know the preference of the system of government and society that you have over the alternatives. I think that is as relevant today as it was in the time when this country was in the Cold War.
And one newsy question, because I just think it's interesting. You say communism is not spreading, but there may be socialism spreading in New York City.
I just heard this news.
That the next mayor of New York is Zora Mandani, who is most likely. It's not definite, but that's what all the indications are tonight. What does that say about the city that you live in, the largest city in the country, the state of the Democratic Party?
It's heartbreaking. I love New York. It's one of the great cities of the world. I moved there 5 years ago, and this news that we got a few minutes ago, if it is confirmed, I don't know, maybe I'll move to California.
Got plenty of room here.
But I'll tell you.
Gavin Newsom welcomes you with open arms.
I'm not sure. He might not count me a win. But if I may make a serious point about this, there are many unlearned lessons from history, and there are many unlearned lessons from the 20th century. But the biggest unlearned lesson is this, and it's played out in this race. Consider the fact that in the middle of the 20th century, there were two horrific death cult ideologies: Nazi fascism, Soviet communism. These both caused more death than any other ideologies in history. But here's the thing, we've learned much of the lessons of what happens when you see fascism coming. I mean, everybody thinks they see fascism everywhere. Maybe that's just an early warning system, and sometimes it's just people who are hysterical. But pretty much, I think, in the West, particularly in this country, we know what fascism looks like. We know what a far-right ideology looks like. We know, for instance, that if people start playing dark games of racial superiority and things like that, we know, we have inbuilt a don't you do that again, we know where that leads. The great unlearned lesson of the 20th century is that the left, by comparison, has never had such a reckoning moment. Whereas we know how you get to Auschwitz, roughly, pretty roughly, but we know. How do you get to the Gulag? I mean, you get there somehow, But the left, and I think the broader culture, has never worked out what the gradations of this are, so that you have, let's say that's the political center. Sorry, I'm doing it the wrong way around for you, but let's say that's the political center, and that's the gulag. You go socialism, communitarianism of some kind, collectivism. And all of these are still totally acceptable parts of the political spectrum. But like somewhere you get to the horrors of communism, somewhere you get to the horrors of the 20th century in Central and Eastern Europe and many other parts of the world. How? Where? Where's the point?
Yeah.
And that's where somebody like the man who I hope is not, but maybe the mayor of New York, that's where they play around. They play around in this incredibly dark, unclear territory which their political side has still not properly litigated.
Yeah.
And so they can say things like, I'm a socialist.
A democratic socialist.
A democratic socialist. Or find me anywhere in the West that would accept somebody who called themselves a democratic fascist. I mean, find me that person. Of course we wouldn't. We wouldn't tolerate that for a moment. Nobody would vote for that. I mean, like 5 nutters somewhere on the Upper East Side, maybe. But no, that wouldn't get any popular play. But democratic socialism, it all sounds so nice. Oh, okay, in which case, at what point do you get to the not nice bit?
Yeah. And it's interesting also that it seems like for so many years the Democratic establishment has worked to stop that from becoming the thing. And you look at, in some ways, there's an argument that the DNC has almost rigged their primaries first off, there was no primary to get Kamala Harris. But then, Bernie Sanders sort of kept back against Biden, against Hillary Clinton. They've tried to keep that power center, the pragmatic, more centrist power center. And here, the Democratic establishment got all behind Andrew Cuomo, and it may not have worked. I mean, Bill Clinton, Michael Bloomberg, all those folks. It shows that maybe the real energy, at least in some areas, is on that left. But okay, that's a whole other thing that we could get into. But let's talk about your book, because the book is fantastic. And one of the things you talk about in your book is that some folks, including potentially the next mayor, on October 8th, were rooting for Hamas and not rooting for Israel. And the book starts by talking about Israel. Let's talk about, though, this death cults phrase, which I think has gotten so much attention, and sort of define how you see this struggle, not only between good and evil, but people who love life and people who love death.
Yeah, it was something that came to me because for most of my adult life, I've thought about this great challenge that the extremists, so certainly the jihadists say, which is we love death more than you love life. I remember we all heard it from Al-Qaeda before and after 9/11. We heard it from ISIS in the 2010s. We've heard it for decades from Hamas, Hezbollah, and many others. We hear it from members of the revolutionary government in Tehran. I'd thought about that a lot, but I'd also underestimated it. And when October the 7th happened, several things happened immediately afterwards that deeply shook me. One was that on the 8th of October in New York City, I went down to Times Square because there was a protest arranged. And the protest was of New Yorkers celebrating the attacks that were still going on. And I was horrified by that. And it was one of the reasons I tried to get to Israel as soon as I could afterwards, because I thought, well, we're going to see some kind of fork in the road here. If there are people, willing to stand in Times Square and celebrate a massacre as it's still going on, this is a moment when you should come to a time of test as a society, and we'll find that there are people who fail it. The failing turned out to be much wider and deeper than I expected. But the second thing is that in the immediate aftermath of the atrocities, as well as going to the sites of the massacres and speaking to the survivors and hostage families and going around the hospitals and the morgues and much more and finding out what was going on, I saw a lot of the footage that was taken on the day, and it was shown to certain journalists and others. It was definitely not for wider publication. But there was a call that was there, which some of you may have heard because it has been released more widely. And it was a call that one of the October the 7th Hamas terrorists made back to his parents in Gaza. Probably some of you will have heard it. For those who haven't, he's in a home of Israelis in the south of Gaza, and he gets on his mobile phone. Again, this is a sort of fascinating and terrible thing about this in this age where you can have a medieval ideology. I'd call it medieval, but that's to insult the medieval ages. It's a medievalist style ideology with smartphones. And this guy phones back to his parents and he says, he gets hold of his father and he says, "Father, Father, I have killed 10 Jews with my own hands. With my own hands, your son has killed 10 Jews." And he is ecstatic. Ecstatic. He says, "Get mother on the phone. Get mother. Get my brother on the phone. Turn on to WhatsApp video. I can show you the bodies. With my own hands, your son is killed." There was something that was rife across the accounts I got from survivors and others of that morning. People like the young people who were dancing at the Nova party in the early hours when Hamas came in. They all had the same thing that they said, which was that the terrorists were elated. Not just barbaric, but elated in their barbarism. And I thought about that a lot. And of course, the statements which Hamas and their backers made for years, they said exactly this. They said how much they loved death, how much they worshipped death. Yahya Sinwar, who and the main planner of the 7th of October, he said, he was in an Israeli prison, some of you will know. I describe his story in the book. He was in an Israeli prison in the 2000s for throttling 4 Palestinians with his own hands. And when he was in prison, an Israeli doctor who was there spotted that Sinwar was falling over after morning prayers in the prison. And he says there's something wrong. And he sends him to a specialist unit that discovers that Yahya Sinwar had a tumor on his brain. He would have died within weeks. And these Israeli doctors saved his life. They operated on him, gave him world-class care, and he went back to prison. And he actually talked quite a lot with the doctor who spotted that he was ill. And the nephew of that doctor was one of the people massacred on the morning of the 7th of October by Sinwar's forces. But Sinwar himself was released in a prisoner exchange after the kidnapped Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit was swapped out for Palestinian prisoners in Israel. And when he was back in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar said in one public speech, he said, we will go into the Zionist entity and we will rip the hearts out of the Jews. Now, we live in a society, thank God, in which all of this sounds impossible. Because our societies in the West are predicated in a way on a presumption. And the presumption is what we want from our lives and with our lives is what everyone wants. You hear this all the time. It's a sort of banal observation that anyone can make. Well, doesn't everyone want the same thing? And to an extent, that can be true. People want to make a living, they want to have a family, or whatever. Yes. But there are also people in the world who want something utterly different, who really do worship death, who really do regard the highest point of life as being to take life. I give an example in the book which was much on my mind, which was Ismail Haniyeh, one of the leaders of Hamas, was in our great ally Qatar throughout the period after the 7th and indeed before. And on camera, some of you may have seen it, he had 4 sons who were all also Hamas leaders in Gaza. And at one point in the war, an Israeli airstrike hit the car which his sons were in, and they were killed on operations. And there is video of Ismail Haniyeh in Qatar being given the news that his sons have been killed. And he's happy. Because for him, they've been martyred. Now, I compare this to the fact that, and I don't mention the name, but I was in Jerusalem around this time, and I was going in early in the war, and I went in to see a member of the government in Israel, in Jerusalem. And I went into the office, this person, and he had his head in his hands because he had just got some terrible news. And the news was that Gadi Eisenkot, who was at that point one of the members of the war cabinet in Israel, the news had just come in that Gadi Eisenkot's son had been killed that morning in Gaza. And the next day, actually, as it happened, Gadi Eisenkot's nephew also fell in battle. And I just remember this member of the Israeli government saying, I've got to call Gadi. I don't know what to say.
And he had been to his bar mitzvah, right?
He said, I was at that boy's bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
And I just remember the overwhelming grief and the proximity of this war. I mean, this isn't somewhere, you send other people's children. These are your children in Israel. And I just thought, what a difference it is, again, and I can give thousands of examples of this, but what a difference in a society where you find out your children are dead and you're happy, and a society where you would do anything but get that news. This, as I say, it's a dichotomy that is everything, but yet most of the Western mind would find almost impossible to comprehend. Like, why would somebody want to go and take life? And I'm afraid the answer is a very, very deep death cult ideology, which is incredibly destructive to the Muslim world and destructive to everyone else as well, but which has to be countered, because it's not like you can make any compromise with this.
Right. Critics of the Israeli government will say that there's a lot of innocent people in Gaza who don't worship Geth, who have been killed in airstrikes and the rest of it. How do you sort of square that? Do you think that Israel has gone too far at times and needs to be walked back?
Well, if I may say so, most of the criticism in the Western media and from, let's say, many politicians is there's been too many innocent deaths in Gaza and it's got to stop. Okay. That's broadly speaking the view. I always have a challenge to these people, which I simply say to them, fine, tell me how you would achieve the following. Let's say we're in New York. Let's say that New Jersey fires rockets for years. Let's say that for 18 years, the government there has used all money coming in to enrich themselves and to build a vast tunnel network in which they can store munitions and hostages and much more. And let's say that right next door to where you're living, this very densely well-built up terrorist infrastructure invaded you, killed hundreds and hundreds of your people, took 250 more hostage. Tell me how you would operate in that terrain to ensure that you kill or capture all the leaders of the people who did this and wipe out their ability to ever rule that entity again. And secondly, how you get back 250 hostages. And I have yet to hear a critic of the Israeli government's actions give me a viable plan for how you would get back the hostages. And there are still several dozen hostages in captivity, some living, and how you would punish and kill the people who did that. Because, just again, if you extrapolate out the population of Israel, about 9 million, to a population the size of the United States, this was equivalent on October the 7th to some 44,000 Americans being killed in one day and another 10,000 Americans being taken hostage. And nobody from left or right, Democrat, Republican, or anyone else has been able to persuade me that if that happened in this country, we would not tear up the earth to get those hostages back.
Yeah. But is But do you think the objective of defeating Hamas, is that possible? Is that possible as a goal?
Well, it's very interesting. Again, there's a type of criticism of the actions of the Israeli government and armies since the 7th of October, which, by the way, I should have said, in terms of fighting a war in a heavily built-up civilian area, the best analyses that we can get, because it's not easy, because everything, as you probably know, all of the death toll figures are the Gaza Health Ministry, which is Hamas. And I mean, the idea that Hamas has a health ministry is itself. But also, all the figures come from Hamas. But let's just concede, yes, a lot of people have been killed. But the best analyses of somebody like Spencer at West Point, John Spencer, is that it's probably a ratio of something like 1 terrorist to 1 civilian. Now, losing 1 civilian for 1 terrorist is terrible, but it is infinitely better than any operation the British Army, the American Armed Forces, or others have been. Most of the operating procedure of other Western armies is roughly 3 to 4 civilians for every 1 target. It's high, but the Israelis have massively outperformed our own past experience in Iraq, in Fallujah, and elsewhere, in slightly similar terrain. So just on that, it's very important to keep that in mind. As for the ideology, I have yet to be persuaded that there is something so extraordinary about Hamas as a force that their ideology can never be wiped out. We have seen many death cult ideologies in history.
The ones you mentioned.
The ones I
20th
mentioned.
century.
Well, let's just take one that, let's take Imperial Japan. The citizens of this country in states like this were told by many people in the 1940s there was nothing you could do. You could fight them. There was no way you would ever eradicate the ideology of the worship of the emperor and so on. And just consider what we knew about Japan as this country was fighting. I mean, we knew that this was an army that eventually had pilots who were willing to die whilst flying their planes into an American ship. Consider the fact that in places like Iwo Jima, American soldiers, young men, were fighting people who were fanatics very similar. Different ideology, but a very similar type of fanaticism. If you'd have said then, in 2025, Japan will be more than within the community of nations. Indeed, will have been for decades. Will be a great success as a society.
Business leader.
Business leaders,
democracy.
in everything. But you would have been able to find people, and you could find people, right up until the surrender. That again, in Japan, was inconceivable before the emperor was forced by this country and its military to cease. You would have found people who say there's nothing we can do to wipe that out. I do not believe there is something so unique about Hamas that among all the death cults we've seen throughout history, this one is uniquely virile. And I would just add that, look at the success of the IDF since October the 7th against all of these people, the individuals, the groups. It turns out that all the people that on American college campuses and on British college campuses, they mourned so much, or they admired so much, they're all gone. And I've got news for those students, by the way, in America and Britain and elsewhere, who've spent the last 18 or so months dressing up in Palestinian terrorist chic and
Queers for Palestine.
Queers for Palestine and so on. I mean, these at some point, I hope these young people grow up, but they've got a heck of a shock, because everybody that they have claimed to admire, apart from being rapists and murderers and sadists, are also now dead.
Is that...
So they can continue to parade with admiration for Sinwar and Nasrallah and all the rest, but they're all encountering their 72 virgins, which is, of course...
Well, when you mention Japan, we should give them credit for their greatest export of all, which is Shohei Ohtani, for those of us here in town. But in terms of those college protests, which you write about in the book, one thing I'm curious about is we saw so many of them last year, and we see so few of them right now. What happened? Why is that?
It's, I do write about the student protest because it's very important. At the same time, I think it's important not to overstate. At the same time, you can't overstate and you shouldn't understate it. But these are elite institutions that turn out to be the most rotten. And this is a very big challenge for all of us and the rest of the West. It isn't the case that, technical colleges have had students dressing up as Hamas for the last 20 months or whatever. It isn't the case that in good community colleges, these young people are going off and deciding actually they're going to litigate a conflict in a...
Because they got to work. A lot
They
of
got to
people
work.
in community college, they got jobs.
They're going to
go
become useful people.
Right.
And it's a problem we have in all of our countries in the West at the moment with elite institutions. And this is a bit of a surprise in some ways. I mean, everybody knows from the 1960s and everything, and again, it's relevant to where we are. There were, in the 68ers, we saw that there were some liberal campuses, Berkeley and elsewhere, where you get the wildest successes. But even then, we didn't have the kind of putrefaction we see now. I mean, in 1968, it was still not cool to actually call for genocide on campus. It was still not the done thing in 1968 to chase Jewish students across campus shouting, "Go back to Poland," or say, "I hope that Hamas gets you next," which is what's happening at Columbia and Yale and Princeton the other week. When another terrorist was killed, the students start chanting "Glory to our martyrs." Who is our exactly in that case?
Yeah.
The martyrs of Princeton?
Yeah.
So this is a very serious defect but it's being taught. And there's a guy I quote in the book who is really, it's an extraordinary thing that this young guy said. He's a student at Columbia University, and he said, I'm a first generation, low income, first member of my family to go to university. And he says, when I got to this university, I learned about the rich history of protest. And I remember thinking, when it kicks off again, I want to be at the center of it. Now, he then says, so when October 7th happened, I realized we were on. And then before you know it, he's living in a tent in the middle of campus screaming at Jews. But just consider what has gone wrong in that. I would like to think that this young guy can at some point deprogram from the death cult he's found himself worshipping. But consider that actually what has gone wrong there is at the institutional level. Why is an American university, partially funded by taxpayer money, telling a student coming up, being given the best chance they have in their life as the first member of their family to get that chance, that to be a student at a university in America in the 2020s, your best use of your time is to be turned into a radical automaton? Why are we telling them why are they encouraged to believe they should become activists instead of doing something with their lives, contributing to the world, contributing to their country? This is something we need to deprogram the universities, but that is why.
And not only activists, but activists for a different country, not even dealing with issues around the university.
I mean, it's amazing that some kid who's, just got to an Ivy League suddenly seems to think they're an expert in urban warfare in a far-off continent. But this is something that needs to be tackled. My own belief is that what the Trump administration has been doing is absolutely right, and I'd like to see them do more. I think, by the way, I was talking about this with somebody from Harvard the other day who thought the president had gone in with a rather heavy hand by stripping their charitable status and so on, and stopping the access of foreign students. But I think most American taxpayers are rather surprised to discover that they are supplementing the income of Harvard to the extent that it is bringing in 30% foreign students. I'm not sure the American taxpayer is aware that they're underwriting not the education of Americans, but the education of the world. And these institutions were not set up for this. I think that the Trump administration's policies, yes, they've been heavy-handed in places, yes, they'll definitely get things wrong. But by the way, watch out for the big trick that these Ivy Leagues are playing, which is they have billions and billions of dollars of endowments. And they're all pretending that the withdrawal of elements of their funding mean, and wait for it, always they say, this cut is terrible. It means that we're going to have to close our cancer research department. No. Don't let's fall for this. Cut the rancid Middle Eastern radicalization department. Do that. Cut off the limb of the whatever it is, lesbian interpretive dance degree class. Get rid of the stuff that's no use. Get rid of the stuff that's no use, it's bogus degrees, where students get heavily into debt for degrees that'll get them nowhere job-wise. Cut that off, but don't let's fall for this thing of them pretending, oh yeah, it's the research into cancer in kittens that we're going to have to stop. No, it's so transparent what they're doing.
I got to let everybody here ask some questions in a moment, so start thinking about what you want to ask. But I have so many more questions I wish I could ask you. We could go for hours. But I want to get one more in, which is, there was a moment on Joe Rogan's show when you were on that went kind of viral, where you talked about the fact that you had been to the Middle East and asking him if he had been. And it was, I thought, really lame that was mocked, because what you realize in the book is how the fact that you have been there and seen it for yourself really changed you and changed your perspective. And I wonder if you could share with us how being there, seeing it, feeling it, meeting people, watching the video, feeling people's pain changed you and changed your thinking.
Well, just on that Rogan thing, yeah, that was rather strange. I'll tell you what I think that was about. The old media, which I spend much of my life, but the old media has got a lot wrong. There's been huge journalistic failings across the media, for sure. You remember the era in COVID where we were told that to talk about a lab leak was racist against the Chinese or something.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of that. I mean, just consider the fact that Jake Tapper has just discovered that Joe Biden.
Yeah. Well, you think about.
Not all there.
Yeah, I mean,
and this is, and his colleague is just. It was very funny. The other week there was a White House Correspondents' Dinner, which I was dragged to by my editor at the New York Post. I don't love it because I don't love journalists awarding themselves awards, because you don't see firefighters having endless ceremonies where they celebrate themselves, But journalists, oh my God.
There's some. I've hosted some of those.
Yeah, I know, but
right.
I don't like them. I sort of backstabbing effect. There was an award given for an investigative journalism award of $25,000 to Jake Tapper's co-author,
Alex Thompson.
Alex Thompson. He's a lovely man and a skilled journalist, but they gave him this award for breaking the news that Biden might not be at his best. In June last year.
Yeah.
And I was just looking around saying, they could have read the New York Post for 6 years.
Yeah.
They could have watched Fox at any time. They might have known this story. And so there's a lot that the press, the media has got wrong, but I do not believe that means that every standard of journalism should just be chucked out, and the future should be a kind of nihilistic, future of just people shooting the breeze on whatever they think and not having done any work. And the thing I think that went viral was I have a rule as a journalist, which is that if I write about a thing, I try to go and see it. I've been writing about the war in Ukraine because I've been embedded with the Ukrainian armed forces and I've seen how they're fighting against the Russian invasion. Even without editorializing on it, that is just normal as a journalist. If you're going to comment on everything to do with Israel and Gaza and so on, everyone can have a view. I mean, I love everyone having a view. But it doesn't mean that every view is equally valid. And it doesn't mean that someone who has literally never been to a region should be regarded as a great expert on the place, because I know that as a writer and as a journalist, you have to put in the legwork.
Right.
And that means going to places you sometimes don't want to go to and seeing things you might not want to see and reporting back. And I'm not willing, just because the old media has made mistakes, to just give up on that. And the example I gave was, imagine if there was a Chinese journalist who's we found out, writing in Chinese state media, who was writing a column every week about the United States and seemed to be under the impression that the situation of black Americans in the United States in the 2020s was a situation of black Americans in the 1790s. And let's say that journalist still believed, I don't know, that we had slavery in America and so on. And let's pretend that that journalist turned out not to speak English and had never been to America. I think we would think the analysis of that particular person was not to be listened to.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same on other stories in other ways around. And I'm alarmed by the dumbing down and the idiotification of a lot of the comment on this. As for the wider point,
Yeah, you went. You not only did you go to Israel, you went to Gaza. You went into the prisons and spent time with some of the people. I mean, how did that experience change you personally?
well, I try to get into this a bit at the end of the book, but it's really this. There was a strange thing that happened in the main year of the war that I write about, which was the number of people back home in America and England who said to me that I changed. The main observation I had, the people said I'd lost some of my natural pessimism.
You're more optimistic from going there.
And I'll tell you why. It's because there's a question that I suspect many of you have thought about all my life, which is, I grew up with grandparents who'd been in the war, and I grew up with those generations, the people left over from the greatest generation, and like every family in my country of birth, we all had, people we'd lost in the family and stories of those days and of what civilians have gone through in the Blitz in London and much more. And there's always been this question in my life, which was, I suspect the question many of you have had, which is, if we faced something like our forebears faced, would we be up to the challenge? And it's a very deep question to ponder on. It's a good one to hold yourself to. And there have been polls in recent years which have worried me enormously. There was one after the invasion of Ukraine that found that it asked American voters, American public, if America was invaded, would you fight for the country or flee? And it was only just a majority of people who said that they would stay and fight. Without making a partisan point, I'm simply repeating the findings of the poll. It was a minority of Democrats who said they would stay and fight, and a majority, but only just, of Republicans.
I think you know the crowd here.
Assuming the rest presumably would flee to Canada. But I found that very worrying. At the same time, one has to remember, polls are polls. Nobody knows, as I mentioned earlier, nobody knows really how you would behave until something happened. But it was very telling. In the UK earlier this year, there was a poll of young people between the ages of 18 to 40, which was the age of the generation that went off in 1914 and again in 1939. And this time found that something like 20-something% of young Brits of that age group said that they would be willing to fight for their country, even under existential threat. Mm. The reason I mention this is because in Israel that isn't the case. In Israel, everyone in Israel, the older generation, all said, I wonder if the younger ones are up for it. They seem to be on TikTok and Instagram, and they want to party in Tel Aviv and so on. But on October the 7th, a moment of enormous trial came, and the young men and women of Israel stood up, and wow, did they stand up. And just to finish it, just to finish this point, the reason I mention this is because this should give hope to everybody. It can be the case that if you educate people well, if you bring them up with a real and deep love of their country, of their faith, of their family, their tradition, if you bring them up with all of that, then if they do get tested as our forebears were, then they could step up too.
Yeah.
But this to me is the answer to it. And I'll just finish by saying that to me has been, and I say this at the end of the book, that has been the biggest realization I've had, is that the death cults say, we love death even more than you love life. And the answer to that is, we do not apologize for cherishing life. We will not apologize for loving life. In fact, it's why we'll win.
Yeah.
Well said. We're going to do our question.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We have time for just a few quick questions because we have to get through signing all of your books after this. So our first question, you, sir.
You mentioned the former leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn. In your view, or your opinion, how do you believe that the current Prime Minister and the Labour government views the actions of President Trump?
We haven't put our best forward in Britain for political leadership, I'm afraid. Keir Starmer is absolutely nowhere on the major issues of the day. There was a call for de-escalation from Westminster, which, as I pointed out last week in the New York Post, was exactly at the time when actually what was needed was massive escalation. But I think, unfortunately, the Starmer government is in that terrible position that unimportant governments find themselves in, which is thinking they have to say something and so saying something utterly banal. The Foreign Secretary of the UK was questioned the other day as to whether or not the UK approved of President Trump's bombing of the reactors. And he did that amazing thing that some politicians do, which is he said, look, the Americans engaged in this military action. And the interviewer says, yes, I know, but do you approve it? He goes, no, we have to get this straight. So the thing is, the Americans have acted. And that means America has, in a real sense, acted. And I don't want you to be under any illusions about the acting nature of the American government. And it just...
Some of our leaders do that here, too.
Oh, yeah.
I've been in those interviews.
It's a giveaway.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not involved. They're unimportant in this. They've made themselves unimportant in this. Again, the British government, like the French government, and all of the others in the West all said, no nuclear bomb for the mullahs. But what were they willing to do about it? Oh, at the moment, they're saying that's why the Iranians have to come back around the table. Yeah, because it worked so well, and you can always trust the Ayatollahs.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, center section, back of the room. You, ma'am, what is your question?
Hi, thank you for coming. Do you think Israel has destroyed most of the ballistic missiles in Iran? And if not, why did they agree to the ceasefire?
I only know what's publicly known, which is it seems like just over half have been either destroyed or have already been fired. It means they have something like, I think somebody will correct me on this, around 1,400 or so left. That's a lot. You do an awful lot of damage with that. I think that the government in Israel has a difficult corner itself here, which is it doesn't want to look like it is going against President Trump's declaration of a ceasefire. It is obviously going to be grateful to President Trump for sending in B-2 bombers and doing the job that the IAF didn't have the weaponry to perform. And so they have a slightly difficult political balance on that. I would think that the next step is really in the hands of whether or not the Iranians do something highly provocative or not. But these things, it's very interesting at these moments. The Iranians, as you know, sent these missiles at the American base in Qatar, and it seems to have been agreed that they notified the US in advance, and troops were taken out of the base so that it was like a peaceful rocket attack. I mean, I would not like to see the Ayatollah wrestle any kind of victory from the jaws of almost total defeat. But these will be very perilous few days. As I say, President Trump has his own careful corner to navigate, but so does Jerusalem. We'll see.
Gentleman off to your right, we'll take one more final question.
It's somewhat parallel but related. We've been talking a lot about the military actions, and a lot of people have called President Trump's actions incoherent, kind of trying to figure out that there's not a consistency to it. I read a fascinating article over the weekend. I wish I could remember the author's name, but analyzed everything that he's been doing in light of something called the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, and that it's really all about him establishing stronger economic ties that have to go through all of those countries where all this turmoil has been occurring for decades, centuries. Any comment on that? I mean, do you see an economic impact on all of this?
Yes, well, I mean, the Trump administration has, I don't think it's incoherent at all. I think it's very coherent what they've done. Obviously, they regard the one economic competitor or rival to this country to being the Communist Party of China, and have been trying to do everything they can to diminish the likelihood of that country ascending economically. And the strange and sometimes fragile axis between Russia, Iran, China, they're obviously trying to do what they can to start to tease apart, and then to set up a counterweight economically, militarily, and elsewhere to that. I thought that the president's visit to the Middle East recently was obviously, I mean, it was what it looked like. It was almost the sort of presidential version of sort of going through the supermarket and putting everything you could in the trolley, or in the plane. But I mean, one of the striking things just about President Trump is when people say, "What do you think he'll do about something?" he tends to have said, He does want to bring business to the United States. He does want to bring jobs here. He does want to bring investment here. He's extremely proud of the investment promises for the time being, that he got on the recent trip to the Gulf and elsewhere. And we'll see. There is a very clear vision in this, if I can say this, and to finish on a rather optimistic note. But there is a rather clear vision that is possible in this. The Middle East is, as Nixon and many other presidents have found, is an extremely hard region to negotiate in and to navigate in. And everyone there will tell you about the vast complexities of it. But there is also enormous opportunity there. A friend of mine recently said that in a conversation with a Saudi royal had said everything got, it was all about 1979. And when the Ayatollahs brought the most radical form of Shia Islam to Iran, we panicked and set up our counterweight to the most radical form of Sunni Islam. You can take that or not take it, but the point is that imagine what would be possible in the Middle East if Iran was not governed by the people who've been misgoverning it since 1979, And they didn't spend their time colonizing other countries in the region and giving ballistic missiles to the Houthis in Yemen and destroying the Lebanon and much more. Imagine what would happen if there wasn't an actual colonialist aggressive power in the center of that region. Because there are many people, including in governments, in country after country there, who would like to normalize, not just normalize relations with this country, but to normalize relations with Israel. And that is what, for this country, for Israel, and for our allies in general, would be the genuinely best outcome from all of this. Because it's what Prime Minister Netanyahu said at his address to the United Nations last year, is the difference between the blessing and the curse.
Yeah.
The curse is what the Middle East has lived through for decades now. Rapacious stealing of wealth by the governing families and others, the indoctrination of the young, the radicalization of the young, a total inability to bring people up socioeconomically. I mean, anyone who's been to countries like Egypt will know you just have young men, let alone the women, just with nothing to do and no prospects. And imagine what would be the case if instead of that and these absolutely stagnant countries with sometimes a massive gas station attached, imagine what would be the case if they learned from America and our allies and actually got involved economically and elsewhere. There's an enormous opportunity there. But as I say, I mean, that would be the blessing version of it. But if I may just, since that's the last question, if I could just say, first of all, apart from what a pleasure it's been to be with you, and with you.
Thank you.
But it's just to say, if there's one thing in particular I'd love to say, it's that I go back to this thing that how we bring up people in particular in this country to view this country is of the utmost importance. If we bring up people in America who are taught to dislike this country, to have a distaste or a disdain for this country, it's going to be very rocky indeed. And on a personal note, I was mentioning earlier as I was going around, I had the great pleasure of knowing Dr. Kissinger a bit. And I was looking through some notebooks of mine recently. We used to have lunch or dinner whenever we could meet in New York or London. And I looked through one of my notebooks recently after I'd had a breakfast with Dr. Kissinger in London, and I used to make notes afterwards because you sort of, Dr. Kissinger, of course you make notes. And I noticed that he'd read one of my books, I can't remember which one, but when we were talking about the issue of education, I remember he said something very striking, which I wrote in my notebook, which he said, it's not clear to me that a country that hates its past can have any future. And this is such an important point. If we bring people up in this country to dislike our past with a very warped and bigoted view of it, we cannot have a viable future. But if we bring people up to realize, and it's not propaganda, it's not to cut off voices or to sugarcoat anything, if we bring people up to actually realize the miracle of what we have in this country, we have a miraculous future possible.
Thank you.
If I may,
Just real quickly, I just want to say thank you for doing this. Thank you for hosting us. And you know what gives me hope also is the fact that all of you showed up tonight, that you care. And a big part of what he's talking about is getting citizens, the most important job that we have, to be active and educated, to learn about these issues, and be willing to be engaged in your communities. So thank you for coming out. Thank you for being willing to learn. Thank you for showing up.